Alright, next for our lineup of remake verses, I wanted to talk about these two, and I guess I should just go ahead and say up front that I'm mainly just interested in talking about these two movies as far as how they work as thrillers, and how they approach everything, and how Demi's movie kind of approached changing some things from the Frankenheimer movie, for the better in some actually ingenious ways, even if I might significantly prefer one of these to the other. Still, it's there's definitely some interesting choices that were made here as we got from original to remake. And that's kind of what I want to delve into the most. Obviously, I know another thing people could talk about with these movies endlessly is how relevant they are as far as today and what they represent. But the thing is that these movies, what's interesting about these movies is that when you really look at them, there's really nothing that gets out of it unscathed, whether it be, a party or a political cause or anything like that. It really does kind of stick a knife into just about everything, but even despite that, obviously, movies like this are always going to be a sort of political Rorschach test, where it's like, you put this movie on a screen and one person could say, oh, this is clearly this thing, this is clearly this person, this is clearly this thing, and this represents that, or whatever. And then you could show it to somebody else, and they'll say the exact opposite. It represents this, it's this person, or whatever. And that's just fucking exhausting. So we're not gonna bother with a lot of that. I mean, obviously, McCarthy might get name dropped or something when we're talking about the original, because that's just kind of so clearly what the intention was. And, the writer, George Axelrod, and even from the novel before the script. And this has been discussed. And there's, an interview or two on this DVD that go into that, but we'll save all that for that. And if that's what you want to hear about, then you can go to that stuff and actually hear it from the makers themselves. I just want to, talk about the movies just in general. So, obviously, one of the first big differences is the war setting, naturally, with one being the Korean War and one being the Gulf War. And it's kind of funny that Demi's movie kind of doubles down on the remake thing, because it also begins with a remake in itself with that pretty awesome interpretation of Fortunate Son by Wyclef Jean. So that's like one of the things that always stood out to me about this movie, was that it has Wyclef Jean's Fortunate Son at the beginning and end of it. So that's how I took away from this, because I did say before when we were doing our Something Wild video for Movie Club that I was never really that big on Demi's version. I saw it in the theater when it came out, and then I actually saw Frankenheimer's not too long after that. I hadn't seen it prior to that, but and while Demi's movie has been trying to grow on me as time goes on, I kind of always loved Frankenheimer's movie from the very first time I saw it. So really, it's also just about how much Demi's movie has potentially grown on me as time goes on, and especially watching them kind of close together might kind of see your perspective in one way or another, change your perspective in one way or another, for better or worse. But going into the next thing, which I guess would be after we have our opening scenes in the Korean War and the Gulf War, we're kind of introduced to snippets of what all went down with the whole brainwashing thing. And these are told in two very different ways, but also take that approach of the fact that these visions are kind of being revisited by the characters through dreams. So naturally, these scenes are going to have this sort of dreamlike or nightmarish vibe to them. And what I really love about the way the Frankenheimer movie tackled that was how it really takes this surreal quality to it, where like Demi's movie really tries to make them like as intense as possible and sort of give like this Jacob's Ladder kind of vibe. I feel like the Jacob's Ladder thing has to be intentional, since they literally say later, like, how do you know you're not, still out there in the war? They say that to Denzel, and it's like, all of this is just, just a vision. And so there's that kind of frenetic nature to that. But here, there's just something so, like, whether it be the way they use the angles or the close-ups or whatever, and the setting of, like, the garden club, where this whole setup looks like one thing and then it's just kind of slowly, gradually revealed to be what's actually happening. But it's the way it's, like, got this garden club sort of facade, where, like, everybody talking about what's going on is so gleeful and smiling when they're doing it. and there's just something so incredibly creepy about it, especially, like I said, as it kind of goes further into what it is, it starts to have this real surreal vibe that does feel like have this nightmarish quality to it. And obviously, as far as the surrealism goes and the treating it like it's, a dream of sorts, the Demi Approach isn't quite as subtle. I wouldn't go as far as to call either one of these movies, by any means, subtle in general, but I do feel like the way the approach to these scenes went down in the 62 movie, there was kind of a subtlety to the surreal nature of it and how things were kind of revealed and, like, how one thing would be shown, then another thing and all that, and kind of show the difference of what the facade is versus what was actually happening. Here it's just sort of all chaos. It's all chaos all the time. Um, and I do like the way Demi utilizes some of his trademarks. Like, not just like how a soundtrack would be used, but like having characters talk directly into the camera, which we've seen in a lot of his movies. And the way that's used here, especially that first Jeffrey Wright scene, where you just get the sense, like, we're really looking into these guys and we just kind of see how broken they are, especially with the way Denzel kind of has to do the whole facade thing himself, where it's like on the outside he looks like, war hero, approachable Denzel or whatever, but then as it goes on very quickly, there's not much hiding this, which is a good thing. It shows us just how, like, broken down and sort of tortured he is, and how you get the sense that something terrible happened, even more so than what was on the surface, and what's underneath is getting significantly deeper, and how it's like, it's sort of that old joke of "you look how I feel." Is basically, we kind of get that sense when we see Denzel in, like, his uniform and looking clean cut, and then we see Jeffrey Wright across from him, and it's like what Jeffrey Wright looks like, just looking so haggard and broken down, is essentially Denzel on the inside. And kind of seeing them both together brings forth the whole feelings of both characters all at once. And that's before we even see Denzel just kind of in his, ratty ass apartment, and he's eating noodles out of a styrofoam cup, and then the way that transitions almost seamlessly to Raymond, in his gigantic room full of riches, and he's eating out of glass and using silver and all that. It's just the complete opposite of Marco's life at this point. And of course that whole ties into the whole thing of reality bleeding into what was going on here, where he was also eating noodles the same way during these, it's like in between kill sessions as they were being brainwashed, and how that's sort of this constant thing where the reality and whatever was going on then is just kind of constantly blurring, and it's like they're never quite sure what's kind of like, we know what was going on, but it's like we're not sure what visions might be somewhat exaggerated as far as what was actually happening, or when it looks like something else entirely. And the way that kind of goes back and forth, I feel like this played really well. And I think especially what works in the Demi movie is the scene where Raymond gets the call from the doctor and then just walks into another room and meets him, and there's something else entirely in there. It leaves you this constant vibe of, is what we're seeing actually real or not? Like, is it actually what it appears to be? So I feel like that kind of stuff, like where it actually feels like they're really toying with the bleeding into reality, and us not knowing, even as the audience, what might be real and what might not be, kind of makes up for how much more surreal those scenes feel in this one, whereas these feel much more straightforward. I do like that it still finds ways to toy with that and kind of bring this similar vibe that this one brings, which is great. Then I guess we can bring in the major character of Raymond's mother and the way she's portrayed between these two movies by Angela Lansbury and then Streep. And with Lansbury being one of the movie's Oscar nominations, on top of editing, I think was the only other one, which is another thing that's playing a big part in this and how it's put together. That sort of reality versus, exaggeration or whatever kind of reality. But here, as far as Lansbury goes, it is interesting that I didn't learn till after the fact, after I'd seen the movie, probably even after I'd seen the movie at least a couple of times, the idea that Lansbury is only 3 years older than Lawrence Harvey, despite playing his mother. But what's interesting is that the first time I saw it without that info, that just never would have even occurred to me. Because there is something that Lansbury brings that's like, the way she carries her authority just kind of makes her seem older in general. I think she's kind of had that for most of her career. Where it's like when you go back to some of her much older movies, you don't realize how young she was at the time because she's kind of carries that sort of thing with her. But what's interesting about that is, while this is a very methodical performance, it's really interesting how this sort of combats with the nature of this character, where even though the character does seem sort of downplayed and methodical, her plans are kind of insane. Like the way she's willing to alter plans in really big ways at the last second, or even the plans, the way they start off with what the initial plan for the assassination is, and then, after she finds out what's been done to Raymond and all this, the way her plans change so quickly but go so big, she could basically be a comic book villain. But yet somehow she seems very subdued and methodical at the same time, which is a really interesting balance that she finds here. And that's not even to go into the stuff that both movies kind of, try to keep under wraps as much as they can, which is, the whole incest thing that comes through in the book pretty blatantly. Obviously, for reasons, not as blatant in either one of these. But interestingly enough, you would think the 60s version would be a bit more censored than the 2004 version. But the fact that we actually sort of get the very bizarre kiss scene in the 60s version, and it's the 2004 one that cuts away before we actually see it, I always found to kind of be this interesting, seemingly kind of role reversal that these two movies do as far as what they're willing to show about this. And that just brings on a whole other sadistic nature to this character that, like I said, on the surface you wouldn't really predict, especially from, seemingly harmless Angela Lansbury. You just wouldn't think. As far as Streep goes, what they've done, one of the ingenious things that they've changed here in the remake is the idea of just cutting out the middleman, and instead of having, Eleanor and the senator being two separate characters and one kind of controlling the other, just making Eleanor the senator in the remake, just combining those qualities into one character essentially, and the way that sort of gives her even more power than we saw that she had before, where like she was kind of behind the scenes in the original movie. She doesn't have to be behind the. I mean, she's still behind the scenes in many ways, but as far as being behind this senator character, everything is kind of going forward. But as far as Lansbury's sort of methodical performance, well, there's definitely a lot of that method in Streep's performance also. You do get the sense that Streep's performance is a bit more over the top, and she gets more like, scenery chewing scenes and stuff like that, and little speeches and stuff like that. But it does seem like, despite this, you would think the quietness would be what brings on, that feeling of control that we talked about Lansbury having, but it does feel like that Streep has... It's not just that she's taking on both roles of the senator character and this character, but just kind of in general in her performance you get the sense that she has a bit more power to her, like she's more in control throughout this, and that could also just be the general Streep factor. Like it's one of those cases where you see this character, and at the time we're at now, and you think, well, yeah, of course Streep's going to play this character. Literally, who else would? And it's like, I'm sure there's plenty of actresses that could have crushed this, but it's like, if Streep's gonna do it, then give it to Streep for sure. And the way that comes through, where it doesn't feel like it. You would think the star power in the remake would be distracting. I guess you could really say that about the original also. But it is interesting how these characters can be so lived in so quickly by these massive names, to where you don't necessarily just see Sinatra or Lawrence Harvey or Angela Lansbury, and you don't just see, Denzel and Streep. And Liev Schreiber was still sort of taking off this time. I remember this kind of being like a sort of break. I mean, I guess you could say the Scream movies were technically a breakout for him, but here you could really feel like it was this, like, he established himself that he could really be at the front of movies like this and take on these really big roles like this and be amongst these actors. I remember the running joke for a while when we would go to the theater all the time around this time and the trailer would play, and the joke was that it was always Academy Award winner Denzel, Academy Award winner Meryl Streep, just Liev Schreiber, Academy Award winner Jon Voight from Academy Award winner Jonathan Demme. And it just made Schreiber stand out so much in this way, to where it's like, it was really showing that he could be amongst this cast and this director and make it work and bring his own sort of power to it, and be what I feel like I remember many people saying he was the standout of the movie. Despite the fact that it does feel like he doesn't quite get as much to do and as much to work with as Lawrence Harvey did, because it does feel like another big difference between these two movies is that despite everything that's going on, it does feel like the original movie is mainly focused on a Raymond arc, and the remake kind of seems more focused on a Marco arc. Which actually does make sense with the changes they make and the directions they go, and it's not just a case of, well, we have Denzel playing Marco now, so we've got to really, make it count. I said not that they couldn't have also done that with Sinatra, obviously, but like especially here where we have names like Denzel and Street, where it's like just give them the movie and let them run with it, and the fact that they didn't do that completely, I think is really great and really commendable, and how easy that could have been. But as great and nearly flawless as Denzel and Meryl Streep are, how it could have potentially hindered the movie also if you had just said, oh, it's them, let them run with it. And the fact that they let the pieces of the movie also work for themselves also, and the fact that they did let Leo Schreiber have those times to shine, and that they made really skillful changes as they were coming over from the 62 movie. But I guess if there's one thing that's I feel like is kind of missing from the remake, it would be stuff like this the sort of mystery element is really interesting in the 62 movie. But once again, it does make sense because by the time we get to the 2004 movie, we already know what's going on, so there's not really much of a need to cover things up. There's still things that are, gradually revealed, like the fact that, Marco was also, killing people during these brainwashing sessions and not just Shaw, but here, not only is there a mystery factor to the movie as it unravels, but there's also the occasional, mysterious character that always kind of gives more of a personality to movies like this when you have an interesting plot as it is and interesting main characters as it is. When you just kind of throw in these little supporting characters that are memorable in their own ways, that's something that always made movies, especially of this era, stand out in themselves. I'm of course, one of the ones I'm thinking of is the Henry Silva character. Where it's like, first of all, not only is he just sort of coming in and out of this movie, and it's like every time you see him, there's just this sense of, oh, I think something's not right, and something's going on. I mean, the way that registers with Sinatra immediately because he remembers him. But I like the fact that they cast somebody like Henry Silva who is so instantly recognizable, but he has a face that's just built for the screen, and to where your eyes just can't leave him. So it makes perfect sense to have a character like him, played by an actor like him, to be this character that's the sort of peak of this character is that he's recognized instantly, and then what that leads to. So it's stuff like that gives the movie a bit more personality. I feel like might be missing from here because there's so many. If you go back, there are so many actors in this movie that you know. You may not have known them in 2004, or maybe even the last time you saw this movie, but there's a lot of people in this that you know now. And so many of them are just kind of in throwaway background roles. And just given little bits of dialogue amongst a lot of dialogue, and then that's about it. Ann Dowd is in there, Dean Stockwell, Oba Babatunde. There's so many people that are just here for a split second. Even Al Franken is in there as one of the commentators. Not to mention some of the director cameos like Roger Corman and Sidney Lumet at the end there. Which is, so like I said, Demi's great about having all these people just kind of thrown in for these little split second parts, but nothing quite as memorable as something like what Henry Silva was in this movie, unfortunately. Because another thing that is interesting about how this one approaches this is that even though the remake is remaking a movie from the 60s, it actually feels a bit more influenced by the 70s era of paranoid thrillers or political thrillers or something like that. The 70s thrillers that were inspired by movies like, the original Manchurian Candidates. But yeah, the approach here where it really takes paranoia into account specifically, the paranoia is a big player in the remake, especially since it's mainly from Marcus' perspective, and he's the one that's kind of trying to put it all together and piece it all together without getting too found out or getting himself killed while he's trying to figure this stuff out. I do like the way they sort of bring in the paranoia factor to the original movie, where it's like one obvious example would be like Jocelyn's place in this, where this movie is real. Jocelyn's very underutilized in the remake, despite being played by the amazing Vera Farmiga. It feels like she only has a couple of scenes, and they set up their past, and then that's about it. Prior to her being killed. But we get the whole sort of Jocelyn backstory in the original movie. And then we get that amazing moment where after all this has been set up, and it kind of feels like the walls are closing in, there's the moment where Jocelyn walks into the costume party and she's wearing the Red Queen costume. And your immediate thought, and essentially probably Raymond's immediate thought is, oh, is she in on this? What does she have to do with this? And just that immediately sets in. And another paranoid factor from the 60s movie is one that apparently is not even technically confirmed. But people have taken it as such, and it is effective in that sense, even if it may not have been in the intention. I still don't know exactly what's been confirmed or not, but yeah, the Janet Leigh character. You'll notice that, she's on the cover, her name is listed with Sinatra and Harvey. Like, it's not, Lansbury's not even listed with these three. She's, well, by the first, oh, by the way, credit, this person's also in this. But no, Janet Leigh's all the way up here. Obviously a couple years post Psycho, which I'm sure is where she probably was instantly recognizable from then on, which would explain that. But the fact that her character is so... We talked about the mysterious characters like the Silva character. I guess she kind of falls into this also. She could easily be seen as that character that's just here because, the main character needs some kind of, female counterpart or, a love interest in a sense or something. But here, there's actually... I pulled up the quote where it says, Janet Leigh found the role of Eugenia Rose Chaney one of the most difficult she had done because, quote, the character was plunked down in the middle of the script with no apparent connection to anyone, transmitting non sequiturs while sending meaningful rays through her eyes. And then it goes on to say, modern interpretations suggest that Eugenia may have also been a double agent, but this idea was never developed in the final version. And I understand where people get that because that's pretty much the only thing that makes sense with this character. So once again, making an ingenious decision, the remake decided to just run with this and add... Maybe not what people were thinking about the lead character completely from the original movie, but giving the role, which is now Kimberly Elise in the remake, more of a purpose, like giving her a secret, and then when she comes forward as a Fed, they are able to use her to kind of start the plot moving in its direction, especially since we're going to be going different directions from here on from the original movie. That was a good call. So, like I said, if you want to look at it as far as it's sort of setting up the paranoid factor of us never quite knowing who the hell Janet Leigh's character is, that could be interesting in itself. But I guess we don't really know what the true intention was, at least completely. But as far as the way it tackles certain things, like one character that we really can't talk about in this one, that we can talk about at great length in this one, is the Senator. Iceland, who has his own thing going on, where this is the case where you can say, like, oh, this character clearly represents something, where he was obviously influenced by McCarthy and that whole thing. And this does sort of play... What's interesting about this, without going too much into the whole, oh, this thing's exactly like this thing in real life, is the way that it plays into the almost absurdity of the plot, and where these characters are willing to go to succeed politically. And the whole, how there's... And this is what the thing is also, where it's this idea of not necessarily a flip-flopping thing going on, where you talk about people in politics willing to go back and forth, whatever will get them the most attention or the most votes. These characters, like, appear to be one thing, but then there's another, and it's like, whenever you hear their dialogue, it means there's, like, such an irony to what their actual plan is, and the way that goes on. Like, you talk about the character of Jordan, and how he kind of seems to see through everybody, and how he describes Lansbury at one point and says, like, basically a communist to her is anybody that disagrees with her, which is something I'm sure you could hear around at any point in time. Like I said, the irony of and how that sort of plays into their plot, and how the plot their plot continues to sort of escalate and sort of change as it goes on. And how after a while it almost starts to blend together what even their intentions are at the end of this, apart from just getting at the top of power, or as far too close to the top of power as they can get. And it's like when you look at this senator character and you see that he's basically everything that you don't want in a person being in power. And there's so much going on here as far as like visual stuff where it's like one thing we haven't even mentioned yet is how much this movie has had a reputation for being like one of the great political satires, despite the fact that you tend to think of 60s political satire, you think of something like Doctor Strangelove, which is so over the top and so clearly a comedy and so clearly a spoof. Whereas this one is this riveting thriller that also just happens to have this satire in it also. So you have scenes like scenes that are like obviously intentionally sort of on the nose, like the caviar American flag, and then just immediately the senator comes in and demolishes it and just takes a giant chunk out of the American flag. It's just saying everything. Or the fact that you could look at it as all the brainwashing is essentially turning these soldiers into assassins, and essentially they're brainwashed, slaves, I guess you could say, because they're basically doing what they're told to by this higher power that controls them. And naturally, how does the senator show up at this costume party but dressed as Lincoln? And it's like just the ironies of it everywhere is that whole thing. And then there's the moment when he's the running joke throughout the movie where every time he's asked, about how many communists are in the State Department and stuff like that, he just says a different number every time that's just off the top of his head. So, and he's like, even with cameras on him, surrounded by crowds, he's so clearly just thinking of a random number. And then there's even the point where this kind of comes to a head, where he's looking at a ketchup bottle and just says 57. And then followed by this sort of long shot of him just dumping ketchup all over his plate, and it's like, we're so on the nose at this point, I almost want to think that also represents like all the bloodshed that's happening because of this, because of the absurd nature of these characters, and this politicians that are seeking power. Like I said, it's so on the nose at this point. I would just take the ketchup thing as that as well, and not just him, where he grabbed 57 out of thin air, or supposedly out of thin air. So I do feel like there's something like that. Like the biting nature of that feels like. It feels like it's present in this one for sure. But it just also feels like it's, and I can't say that it's more subtle by any means, but it does feel like there's a biting nature still sort of missing from this one. That this one just really, I guess, executed so well. That it feels like it's not quite hitting as hard in this one, and it's something that's kind of hard to replicate anyway. Because satire in any way, and how do you even replicate satire after something has done it so well? Obviously there's going to be changing times, and obviously the political satire was obviously different in 2004 than it was in '62. So there is always going to be material, but I still feel like it just wasn't as well done as it was in the '60s one to stand out in the way that it does. And as far as, I don't know that I talked enough about Liev Schreiber. He does have a lot of great moments in this, like when he talks about, when he has to sit down with Marco and they're talking, it's basically what could have been the I'm not lovable scene in the original with Lawrence Harvey. But what I really love about this is the way it kind of continues to go into that surreal nature, where we do have a real sort of moment here between them, and then this ultimately leads to Marco ripping his shirt off and biting into his back, trying to get the chip out, or whatever it is, out. And it's like, just the surreal nature of that happening is insane. And so the fact that the movie is willing to jump to those lengths to kind of keep the surreal quality going, even when we're in clear reality, I do really like. But I also like the human nature of Raymond that's shown throughout the movies, particularly the original. So I do love the scene we get with Schreiber, where he finally tells Marco, and he's able to get face to face with him with nobody else around, thanks to the help of Kimberly Elise, and he's talking about how he has the dreams, and then there's just this real moment, and that's another scene where we get the talking directly into the camera, where we can really see directly into the souls of these people. And it's like I said, Demme doesn't use his trademarks just, for whatever reason. There's always a purpose. We especially talked about that when we talked about Something Wild, like his soundtrack choices. Like, there's always a reason Demi used the same techniques multiple times, and you can really see that here, especially with how sparsely he uses that, but how effectively it tells us exactly where these characters are and how worn down they are at this point, which is especially important since they're taking us into the climax. But before we get to that, yeah, I did also want to talk about the I'm Not Lovable scene here, where we do get the whole Jocelyn backstory, and it's like the way we get to see Harvey so sort of vulnerable in the state, and we can kind of see the breaking down, because we can see the back and forth between when he's under control and when he isn't, but there's this sense where it's like when he's not under control, there's just something always lingering, like something's always going to be sort of gone. And then when we see, this backstory where he was totally in love with Jocelyn and that whole thing, and then when you see what the characters become, it just becomes this huge tragedy, is what it ultimately is at the end of the day. And to see that, and then there's even the moment when he kills the Jordans, where it's very sort of feels like has this dark and visceral feel in the remake, which definitely has its own impact. But here, this moment where it's like there's the detail where he shoots through the milk to get to Thomas, and then when he goes to Jocelyn, it just seems like this cold-blooded, robotic murder. But then there's that moment where he's leaving the house, and I could swear you see like tears on his face, like he's still sort of in there, where in the moment he can see what he's doing, but then once he's out of control, it's gone again. And so there's something really intriguing about that, but so incredibly tragic. And I feel like that while Shriver's performance is great, and we definitely get like seeing that sort of broken man like from the inside of this sort of clean cut political figure. Yeah, with Harvey, you just really get the sense that this person's just getting more and more broken down and emotionally distant, and just everything has been taken from him. To where, like I said, by the time we get to the climax, the point that we reach makes sense. And now, what's really great is that, yeah, I had talked about how this feels like the climax we've seen a lot, because this movie seemed to influence so many movies, especially in the '70s and in this genre. Where, yeah, when you come back to it, this is essentially one of the most suspenseful climaxes of all time, probably. And the build up, and how like we supposedly know exactly the way it's going to play out, and then it just. I mean, obviously, when you see the build up to the movie, there's the way that you hope it's going to play out, which is what plays out. But yet, the way it's been so perfectly laid down, what is supposed to happen here for this assassination, and then the turn that it takes. But then there's just that one final turn where Marco witnesses his suicide. That just is the final, period at the end of this extremely tragic sentence that this whole story of Raymond Shaw has been. And so, with that whole setup, and this being one of the most famous and suspenseful climaxes of all time, how much better could you have done remaking the movie by setting up the fact that you've already set up that you're remaking the movie with one of the most suspenseful climaxes of all time. So when you already set up before we get there that the climax has changed and the people are in different positions now. You go into this, and the thing is like, how do you remake the most suspenseful climax of all time, but also, keep the suspense? And it's like, yeah, you go into this, and even though you know everything about the ending of the '62 movie, you go into this and you realize you now know nothing about how this is going to end and how this is going to play out. And so you think even when it gets to the very end, and you think like, well, if obviously the characters have changed, but if it's still going to play out this way, then that means, is Marco going to kill himself? And then that question in itself, even if you're already under the impression, oh yeah, he's probably going to kill Raymond and Eleanor, the way that the senator and she died in the original movie. So now it's like, and like I said, that kind of goes into that whole thing about this being much more of an Marco arc rather than the Raymond arc that we saw in this one, which I can also appreciate. But I still just feel like the original really captured, the characters and the suspense and just the feelings of all the different characters really well. Like, I guess if there's one thing as far as character goes that the remake has, it's that those shots where we do get to see like in the character souls, and the way we kind of get to see like Jeffrey Wright especially, and like how he's sort of what Marco could ultimately become and is pretty much on his way to already. And then, like I said, the choices that it made as far as what it was going to change, and it was never just for the like anything Demi, it's never just for the sake of it. So like everything had a purpose here, whether it be a directorial choice or a change from the original or whatever. That's very well done. But I said it when you look at it though, there does still feel like there's stuff missing, whether it be the surreal quality or the extent that the surreal quality goes in the original, or some of the air of mystery or whatever. And it's and the performances and the approach to some of the characters and the like I said, the mystery angle to like Janet Leigh or Henry Silva or whoever. I just will always find the original just significantly more intriguing and definitely the one I'm much more likely to come back to. I feel like even though I saw the remake first and I saw it in the theater when it came out, I feel like I've seen the original at least twice as many times as this one because that's the one that I'll just kind of always come back to, and the one that I liked from the get-go. Like from the first time I saw it, I knew that I loved this movie, and Demi's movie is still getting there, and I'm still appreciating it. And it's interesting, especially, and I feel like it's telling how good it is as a remake. That I feel like the more like usually it'd be the case of if you love the original and you're trying to really like the remake, that the more you compare it to the original, the worse it's going to look. But interestingly enough, with how well it was, shifted and the changes that they made, the Demi movie actually gets better the more you compare it to the original. I don't know how many remakes you can say that about, which is very unique and interesting. So, that's pretty much how I feel about these, I think. So, I'm not quite sure what the next one is. So, like, everything that's been pre-recorded for September is already out, so now I'm just kind of going as I go. So, that's where we are now. But, the next thing should be another, William Hurt video, and then... yeah, and then we'll go from there. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.